Hey everybody, how's it going? So today we are going to go over how to rebuild the new process NP249 transfer case. This particular one came out of a 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, and we're going to go through the entire rebuild process and take a look at what's involved. I have here my input spline along with the planetaries. This was taken out when I last took it out of the vehicle. It was the wrong size because it came out of a donor vehicle, so this is the correct size for the vehicle that I have. I also have my dealer service manual printed out for this section. The NP249 transfer case section, in case you want to follow along in your dealer service manual, is section 21-319. I also have a new chain for the transfer case. Often these are stretched out or worn out after many years of service. And then I have a complete rebuild kit, including all of the seals, and including quite a few of the bearings and needle bearings and other details that need to be switched out, and the selector fork plastic inserts. Okay, so we're going to go through things step by step, and hopefully everything will make sense. Okay, so we're going to be starting on page 323, where it says transfer case disassembly and overhaul. And the very first thing it says to do is to position it on a shallow drain pan, remove the drain plug and lubricant. This transfer case has already been drained, so I'm going to skip that step. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the front yoke. So this right here is the front yoke, and we're going to have to take this inside of it out. I'm going to have to figure out what wrench and probably get a pipe wrench to hold it in place. Okay, so it ended up being a 28mm socket. I've got my pipe wrench on here, and I put a piece of rag in between the pipe wrench and the yoke because I don't want to mar up my nice front drive shack spice yoke here. And what you want to do is brace the pipe wrench against something, and then you're going to go ahead and put some pressure on it. And in this case, break it back off. You may not need the pipe wrench if you have a really good grip, but I found it's a lot easier than fighting it. So first things first, there goes that nut. Okay, so I got the pipe wrench out of the way, and we're just going to grab the yoke by the edge there and pull it off. Now right here there's a little rubber, what do they call it, yoke seal washer. And you want to just be careful to pull this off without destroying it if you need to reuse it. And then it should come off like so. We'll probably be replacing that, but in a lot of cases you might not. Alright, so our next step is going to be to remove the rear retainer bolts. I'm going to flip this around. You can see that this section here is the rear retainer, and there are 4 bolts that hold the retainer onto the transfer case, and we're going to take those out. I'm going to go grab a wrench to do that. Okay, so in this case they ended up being 1/2 inch, and you might want to brace the transfer case with something to give you a little leverage by putting some wood blocking or something under it. I'm going to take out all 4 of the 1/2 inch retainer bolts. Okay, I'll spare you the rest of the process here. Okay, so I got all 4 of the retainer bolts out. You can see each of them has some red Loctite on them, so we'll need to be sure to put that back on when we reassemble it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this rear bearing locating ring access cover. So what you need is a T25 Torx bit, something that looks like a little star on the end. Some of them might have a regular Phillips screwdriver. We just take these 2 small screws out to get the access cover off. And depending on how long it's been, you may want to replace this gasket underneath this, or it may be reusable. We'll have to take a look at it and see. In some instances, this whole cover can take some effort to get off. You may have to get a scraper or something to be able to take it off. Yeah, this one's sealed on there pretty good. So let me get a scraper. So once the screws are removed, you can take a scraper and a small hammer, and you can place it like so, and tap a little bit until you start to break the seal. And you should get the whole thing off, and it'll probably have the gasket stuck to the back of it. I'm just going to pull that off that way for now. And now we have access to the rear retainer locking ring. The next step is to break the seal on the rear retainer. You'll see that there are 3 of these locations where you can put a pry bar on the retainer and then push against it to create tension on the seal. You may also go around the seal with a scraper like I just showed you to put some more tension on it. It's going to take some doing, and you need to bang on it a little bit sometimes. You also need to be careful not to damage the retainer or the case in the process. So I'm going to beat on this for a little while, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so I cleaned off the RTV around the outside and hit it a little bit with a micro torch to help get it loosened up. You need to get in there with a screwdriver first and move the snap ring into a position in the middle so that you can get it with the snap ring pliers. Once you have it in the right place, you need to take a pair of snap ring pliers and you need to set it on there, and you need to open the snap ring. Now the snap ring usually can be moved off a little bit to one side, and hopefully your snap ring pliers are tight enough that the ends of the snap ring cannot pass through them. And you want to open it up as wide as you can, and then at the same time pry against the boss on the retainer to see if you can break the entire thing loose. It may take a few efforts, and you may have to get a hammer and pound on it. So I ended up flipping it up on end. Once you have the ring disconnected from the inside, sometimes you can get it to hang in a position where it's still caught in the retainer, but it's not on the ring anymore. At that point it gets a lot easier to break the retainer free because the ring's no longer in your way, holding on to the metal in the inside that connects to the output gear. So this RTV is old. Might actually be the first time this transfer case has ever been taken apart here. So I'm just going around the seam where the RTV is holding it together and heating it up to create a little bit of gooiness in there. Hopefully make it a little bit less difficult to break it free. It does take quite a bit of force to break this free in general. You have 3 different places you can pry on it. You can see one of them right here and one of them right there. Third one's over here. And you do sort of need to put work into all of them. In the case of these 2, you have the case to pry against, but in this case you have quite a bit of gap, so sometimes you need to put a little block of wood in there or something like that. Okay, so if all else fails and it's really on there good and you have access to it, this is a pretty good instance to use some porta power. You can get a hydraulic wedge like this one and set it up in such a way that you can create pressure on it with the piston. And then move it around to all 3, creating equal pressure on each one as you go. The moment I have the snap ring pushed open with a pair of pliers holding it open, and you can see that that actually worked to pop the entire thing out. Even once we have broken the rear retainer free, unless the snap ring is in exactly the right location, it still will not come off. You may try turning the entire thing back on its side. I'm going to do that next. Okay, now that it's broken free, we can attempt to wiggle the whole thing apart by pulling the snap ring open and moving it this direction away from the body of the rest of the transfer case. This can sometimes be just an annoying step because there's not a lot of clearance between the metal gear inside and the exterior. Okay, the pair of snap ring pliers I was using before were unable to push the snap ring far enough and get clearance, so I ended up using some parallel jaw snap ring pliers so that I could get full clearance. Then you can remove the retainer entirely, and you can see that the snap ring stays inside the retainer when you take it off. Alright, so the next step is to remove the speedometer drive gear. Be sure to remember which end was toward the snap ring here. It has the smaller end, not the end that protrudes. And you want to just take it all the way off. Okay, the next thing we're going to have to do is remove this rear bearing snap ring. And this is the rear bearing here. And you can hear it makes a little bit of noise. We're going to end up replacing this bearing. So the pliers I already just had should be set up in a way that they can do this. Get in here and we'll open this snap ring up. And then it'll slide off like that. And then the rear bearing should come all the way off, just like that. Now remember which side had the groove in it. The groove in this case was all the way towards the back of the retainer. This one looks pretty solid. He doesn't really look worn out. We're going to end up replacing him anyway. Okay, so now we're going to disengage the oil pickup tube from the oil pump and remove the oil pump assembly. This is the oil pump they're talking about right here. And there's a pickup tube with a little sleeve in it and an O-ring. Or maybe not an O-ring, but a sleeve nonetheless. And it comes off right there. That's what the tube looks like. You just need to set it aside where you won't lose it. And then this oil pump assembly comes off like that. Again, just mentally remember which way it was oriented. Now mind you, a lot of these things aren't usually worn out on these devices. Very tough. It's designed to withstand a lot of four-wheel drive action. Okay, so we're going to flip it up so that the rear of the case is up, much like I had it a minute ago. And we want to take a piece of wood or something and brace it underneath it. A lot of different ways you can do this. Pretty much just want it solid so it's not going to fall over on you. Okay, now we're going to go through and we're going to remove these bolts that attach the front case to the rear case. Okay, so for the vast majority of the bolts all the way around the case, it's going to be a 15mm socket. And then there's this one little special bolt here on the top, and it has a nut and it has a 12-point 10mm socket. So you're going to need to find one 12-point 10mm to be able to take this top nut off. And the bolt on the back of it, or I'm sorry, the nut on the back of this bolt is also a 15, I believe. Let me double check. Yeah, it's a 15. So 15mm for all of these. Just work your way around the case. Take all of them apart. If the case won't come apart, again, porta power could be used on either of these two locations to pull the case apart. Okay, so I ended up using an air ratchet to go through and take out all the bolts. You'll note that the bolt on this end and the bolt on this end have a washer. They definitely need to go back with the washer on them. And then there's a little wire catch that goes on the special bolt on the top. That wire catch is for the wiring harness. You also want to make sure you don't lose that. I took a wire brush and I went around the mating surface for the retainer and just brushed it off real good, and then did the same thing on the mating surface on the retainer itself. Just removing any RTV, any grease. It's also good to take a microfiber cloth and just wipe them off once you get all of the actual glue out of the way and make sure that there's no more fluid or grease on that surface. Okay, and so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the porta power and we're going to put it into these three different locations here that let you pry the case apart. And we will just see if we can get the case apart. That came apart pretty easily. Just close the port of power, come across here, and do the same thing on this side. Okay. And then lastly, there's one on the top. Just make sure nothing is stuck. I can do the third one. Looks like it's pretty much open already, but we'll see. Alright. And in a basic way, that's the case is open. And you just have to watch this little piece of the oil connector. Just work it up. And it's sliding on this pin right here. Eventually it'll come off. Alright, we can see inside there. Here's the chain. And the rest of the interior parts. We'll have to also clean this mating surface between the two halves of the case. And there's this surface here to clean. Another detail I should mention is that here on either end of the case is a place where you could insert a flathead screwdriver if you don't want to push on the case with something like porta-power. There's a spot right here and a spot right here. They were the locations that the two bolts had washers on them. And either one of those locations will accept a flathead screwdriver like this. You can push it in and then pop the case apart and do the same thing at the other end. It may be easier to do. I already had the porta-power here, so I just pushed on the case itself. One of the first things we can do is pull this magnet out of the bottom of the transfer case. This magnet sits in a position where it can collect any little pieces of debris that come off of the chain, or heaven forbid, that come off of one of the gears if they get ground up. And you just want to be sure to clean it and set it aside. Make sure you don't lose it, because we're going to need to put it back in when we put things together. There's also a little screen here that you can see connects to the oil pump pickup. It's a good idea usually to take some compressed air and blow that screen out. So here I just removed the oil tube pickup. You can see it there. And if you take a look at it, there's a bunch of junk that's collected in there over time. Just want to make sure we get that junk off before we reinstall it. Then there's also one bearing in the back of this case. We're going to end up pulling that out and removing it, putting the new bearing in there. This one feels in good shape though. It's up to you whether you have to do all of these different details, or whether you just have to focus on the details of how your transfer case is worn out. One time when I opened one of these transfer cases, this chain had become so slack that it was digging into the bottom of the case and cutting away at it. You can see in this particular one I still have quite a bit of room before that's happening. In fact, this chain looks relatively new. So I may or may not replace it, we'll see. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove the oil locating pump snap ring and then the viscous coupling snap ring. This part right here is the viscous coupling, which hopefully you won't ever have to replace. It's pretty much the most expensive part in this transfer case. You just want to open up the snap ring enough to get it to clear around the gear that it's getting lifted off of. Just barely. Then it should come up like so. You can set it aside. Try to remember which side is up. Doesn't matter terribly, but in case it's gotten a little bit convex over time, it's a great idea to put it back in exactly the same position you took it out from. And then the same thing with the other snap ring for the viscous coupling. It's probably going to require a pair of snap ring pliers that have a little bit more clearance on them It also might require you to grab near the outside of the snap ring. And you just want to work it up gently in the same manner. Hopefully it won't laugh at you like it's laughing at me. Sometimes one part of it will come up and the other part won't, which will allow you to get a different pair of snap ring pliers onto it. Just be patient and try not to bend it any farther than you have to. And it should come up like that. Okay, so now we should be able to disengage the viscous coupling from the drive gear. And it comes off in one piece. Just want to set that aside like the oil pump. So next we're going to remove the drive gear snap ring. We're on figure 19 if you're following along in your book. Yeah, remove drive gear snap ring, disengage drive gear. Alright, so the snap ring is down here in the drive sprocket. You can see it just behind this little gear right here. And in a similar manner to the others, we just need to put some pressure on it to open it up. And hopefully we can open it up large enough that it'll come out of there. Okay, so that snap ring pliers was not working. Got this other pair of snap ring pliers here. And hopefully these will open up large enough to help me get this one out. Just try to be patient with it. Sometimes you might have to open it on the one side and then push it up on the other side. Sometimes you can get one side started. Effective trick might be get another screwdriver, and once you've pushed it just far enough to get one side up, wedge the screwdriver underneath it so that it doesn't fall back in the same location. Then you can work your way around with the screwdriver and push the snap ring out of position. Alright, so I had to get a larger pair of snap ring pliers and come in here. Sometimes you can lift up either end of the snap ring using a screwdriver and little by little work the edge of the snap ring up. And careful not to bend it too far, but a little bit is sometimes necessary, because we want to end up with position where you could put a larger pair of snap ring pliers on it and push it apart far enough that it will come off. So sometimes you have to use a screwdriver like so and wedge it under one side, and then do something similar on the other side, so you have access to both parts of it. And as long as you can get it out, you can take a different pair of snap ring pliers and get in there in such a way that you can push as far as you need to apart. Alright. And you gotta wiggle it back and forth until you can get clearance. And continue bending up on it until you remove the snap ring. Go ahead and set that aside. It's going to be just as hard to get it back on. I'm about ready to disengage the drive gear, and that's going to be this entire gear here that has the chain on it. Take the drive gear off. You should be able to remove the chain from the drive gear and pull the entire drive gear off like so. Okay, now you should be able to remove the chain. So here's our chain. It's in pretty good condition actually. Looks like it's happy. Again, we want to remember which side is up, because we want to put it back in the transfer case in the same way it came out, or we may be replacing it with this new chain and have to measure them next to one another and see how they size up. They look pretty much exactly the same. Alright, we're moving on to figure 23. Remove the main shaft and differential assembly. So now that we have the main drive gear removed, we can remove the front output shaft and the drive gear as an assembly. So that's this part right here. Take this off and set it aside. You'll be able to see the selector fork and the part of the gear that it hangs on to. Alright, next we're going to remove the detente spring and the assembly and the O-ring that goes with it. In this case, I have a 7/8 socket that fits on there real good. And you're just going to go ahead and back that off. This is the thing that gives you the click when you select between the two ranges and neutral. In this particular transfer case, there's only 3 possible selections. So you just take this thing off, and you'll have a spring that comes with it and a small shaft of metal with a plug or a rounded part on the end. And all this stuff comes out like so. So you have the cap, the spring, and the actual piece of metal that holds the selector fork wherever it is. Set that aside for reassembly. There should be an O-ring, a rubber O-ring on the outside edge of this. You can see it in there. Small O-ring. That'll need to be replaced. Or not, depending on its condition, the last time you replaced it. So it says to rotate the selector fork until the teeth face upward. Okay, we're going to remove the range fork, rail, and clutch sleeve as an assembly. So that will be all these things you see here. And what I had to do was just rotate them to the left to get this part to come out of the selector in this case. Okay, so this entire assembly comes out. And what we want to check to make sure of is that these plastic pieces here on the selector are in good condition and not broken. We may be replacing these. There might be some crud built up on there from the plastic getting worn over time. In every instance, we'll have to decide whether to replace these parts or whether they're doing good enough to just be reinstalled the way they are. And you want to remember how this was oriented in relation to the selector fork. Put that off to the side along with... Alright, next we're going to take the entire unit and we're going to turn it on its side once more so that we can get at the front bearing retainer bolts. Okay, so these bolts on the front bearing retainer right here, all 4 of them are 10mm, and they hold the front seal and they hold the front bearing in place. So we're just going to go ahead and remove those bolts to help us get access to that front bearing. And you may need to set up everything in a way that lets you get some leverage. Let's see here. Actually, I need the other socket wrench. Okay, so after you get the bolts out of the front retainer, there are some places on the edge of the retainer, I think there's 1, 2 places, possibly 3 places, where you can fit a flathead screwdriver in there and then pop it off. And there's a mating surface on the inside of the retainer that'll need to be cleaned off, and the mating surface on the case here that will also need to be cleaned off. Okay, so this is the mating surface that you need to clean on the inside of the retainer. This seal here will need to be popped out with the seal puller and then put in. I usually put in these seals with a little bit of blue Loctite around the outside. The blue Loctite just helps to seal the outside of the seal to the case in case it wants to leak at any point. Usually I set the seal with the seal setter. You have to find the correct size. Sometimes you can find a socket, but in this case you're not going to find a socket that big unless you have those really huge 1/4 inch drive sockets. Then we're going to clean up the same mating surface here, and while we're at it we can clean off the mating surface for the transmission, which is this outer one here. There's a snap ring that holds this bearing in place. We're going to have to open this snap ring up, much like all the other snap rings I showed you, in order to get this bearing out and be able to change it. Now in a lot of different places we need to clean some of the Permatex or RTV off of things that are inside of a hole. What I'll often do is just take a similar sized drill bit, a little bit smaller, just twist it through there until I've scraped off all the old material. You don't want any material that can get in and clog up this pickup in the oil filter later on. So we want to make sure to get everything as clean as we can, just like when we're rebuilding a transmission. This is just a tool I can use. Stay away from anything that has threads in the hole, obviously. You don't want to damage the threads. But on the other side of the case, where there are no threads, there's also an easy way to just get the old material out of my way, so we can get things nice and clean before we put it back together again. So in the retainer for the front drive shaft, we have a seal. And when you remove that seal, there's a bearing behind it. That bearing didn't actually come in this rebuild kit, and you have to determine whether you want to replace it or not. I have that other bearing in a few places in my transmission parts, but I can see by looking at it that there's still quite a bit of the original bearing left. You'll have to make your decisions based on how much of the bearing is there. I have a replacement for this seal here, so it shouldn't be too hard to pull it out. Okay, so your next step if you're disassembling the full assembled unit is that you're going to take this input and its drivetrain and you're going to slide it out of the case this direction. In my case I already had it out, but you'll have to take this snap ring off of the input shaft to make sure that you can slide it through this main bearing. Whole thing should come out. If it doesn't, you got to jostle it around a little bit until it comes out of the main gear in there. Okay, so I probably should have gone over how to get the input snap ring off. Usually I have to take one pair of snap ring pliers and hold it in place while I either use a couple of screwdrivers or a pick to get behind it and move the edges of it out just far enough to get it with the other pair of snap ring pliers. So this requires putting the right amount of tension on it without putting more tension on it than you need to get it just in the right position where you can use the larger snap ring pliers and get behind it. It can be pretty difficult to do. Sometimes it's really frustrating because every time you move it, it starts snapping itself back into place. So sometimes you have to wedge something behind it and have just enough of it up that you can take the snap ring pliers out and it remains in position. Then you can get the other snap ring pliers behind it. Like I said, it can be pretty frustrating. Just need to be patient with it. You don't want to bend either side of the snap ring too much, and you don't want to end up in a situation where it's in the wrong position when you put it back in, which is what just happened to me trying to reinstall it. So I've got one screwdriver behind it on one side and a pick behind it on the other side. That's letting me get enough clearance to get this pair of snap ring pliers back onto the snap ring, oriented in your hand in such a way that you can actually push on it. And if for some reason these are in your way, you may need to move it several times. Even when you have a grip on the snap ring, you may still have to go around with another tool or a small screwdriver to get it out of the groove enough that you can actually remove it. This can be pretty difficult to do while you're trying to keep a grip on it. Sometimes I'll work around the outside of the snap ring with another tool, attempting to open it enough that I can move it out of position and get it off of the shaft. Alright, so next we're going to remove the range lever, lock nut, and the lever itself and its washer from the shift selector's shaft. It's a 9/16 wrench. Just place it so it's up against the case and then pull backward on it. Okay, so once this is loose, the nut comes off, the washer comes off, the lever comes off. I want to take a look at where it was on the inside so you can visually remember how to put it back together. And then the selector shaft pushes into the case. And there's only one way you can orient it to get it out. And then that's the selector. Put it aside. If for some reason you haven't already removed the magnet from the case, now is where it tells us to remove the magnet in the instructions. So I'm not going to actually take the input gear out in this case, but if you needed to take the input gear out, there's a snap ring on the inside of this assembly that needs to be popped out, and then this input gear will come in and out. For different Jeeps of different years, there are two lengths of this input gear. This is the longer one because I'm working on a 94 Grand Cherokee. I think after 96, this input gear becomes shorter. So while all the other parts of the transfer case are similar, the input gear is a different length. If you have the wrong length input gear for the transmission setup that you have, it definitely will be an issue. It may even go back in correctly and still not have the correct amount of power transfer. That could lead to breakage or other issues. There are some tab washers in here inside the input assembly. They both look like this. If they need to be replaced while you have it apart, you can replace them. Okay, the next step is going to be to disassemble the main shaft and the differential assembly. This part right here is the differential assembly, and the thing going through it is the main shaft. And you'll see here on the end of the main shaft there's a snap ring. Once we take this snap ring off, this whole thing comes apart. The differential assembly also comes apart by removing a snap ring on the inside here. Now in most instances, unless something has majorly gone wrong, you're not going to need to take this apart. In fact, with the exception of the tab thrush washers that go inside the input assembly with the planetaries, there isn't very much in there that needs to be replaced. The differential carriers are all these little gears here, and you can see it comes apart with a screwdriver. If you do end up taking the differential apart for any reason, you're going to want to mark it, and you're definitely going to want to pay attention to where your mark is, because it's going to need to come back together exactly the way that you took it apart. So in this instance, I know that this is functioning good. I have good clean movement in all the parts, so I'm not going to actually take this apart right now. But if you do need to take it apart, it starts with this snap ring, and after this piece is removed, there's a second snap ring inside there. And then there are 4 bolts. You can see them here. Actually, there's 6 of them, I'm sorry, in this version. And they're recessed into the differential assembly. You'll have to remove those if you have any damaged gears or damaged sections. If this doesn't rotate fully by hand easily, there is a possibility that one of these carrier gears or the main shaft sprocket gears may be damaged in some way. The sprocket gear will come out of there once it's disassembled. There's also a bearing right here that all of these things ride on. This bearing is not included in the rebuild kit, but should it be damaged in some way, you may need to replace that bearing. It's going to be a difficult bearing to get out and get back in again. I only recommend replacing it if you actually need to replace it. This is the entire disassembly process for the NP249. It's now fully disassembled, and we can start cleaning all of our components. We want to get any dirt and any black residue out of everything in the interior. There is an additional seal in the rear output right here, and an additional bearing. It also has a snap ring. That part just pulls out. Once you remove this snap ring, this bearing can be removed, and this seal can be removed. Both of them are going to depend on what condition they're in. If they're damaged in any way, you definitely want to replace the bearing and the seal. To get the bearing in and out of the case is going to take a bearing setter, and it may take a bearing puller to get it out of the case. I'm not going to do that in this particular instance because this bearing looks really happy. Alright, so next we'll begin the assembly process. Okay, so we are just about ready to begin reassembling our NP249 transfer case. I spent a lot of time cleaning the two halves of the case and using compressed air to blow out any details of glue or dirt or anything on the inside of the case. If you actually got it clean, you probably wasted way too much time of your life getting it put back together, but it is what it is. And for any of you who need some advice, I used mostly a nylon brush, a pick, and a wire wheel attached to an electric corded drill like this. That let me get most of it. I also used some Q-tips and some paint thinner. There's a lot of different solvents you can use. To put it back together again, we're going to need some Permatex or other equivalent. I'm using Ultra Black because I like the Ultra Black. You're going to need some torque wrenches. I have two different sizes of torque wrench, depending on what we're tightening. A lot of details about how to pull all these bearings and how to replace these seals. Most of them are pretty straightforward, the way that you always pull a seal in transmission. There are a couple retainer seals and bushings that are pretty difficult to do, like this one in the back of the retainer right here. It's actually usually separate and comes in a transmission kit. In mine, this is the one that looks like it's the most worn, but it's still not so worn that it needs replacement. And also, you want to make sure that you cleaned the inside of the retainer really good, because a lot of little pieces of RTV or glue can collect in there. Transfer case assembly and adjustment. It says to lubricate the transfer components with Dextron 2 fluid. You can use ATF4 as well. You're not supposed to put this thing back together again completely dry, but in most instances it can be partially dry. I didn't really wipe the fluid off of everything yet. When you are cleaning things, you want to be using something other than paper towels, something like a microfiber cloth, so that you won't leave any component or any little pieces on the components. All those little pieces can accumulate and then they can clog this pickup. I took compressed air to the pickup and cleaned it until it's really clean. You might have to go through it both directions because it picks up on both sides. Now we're supposed to take the case and support it on wood blocks again. With nothing in it, the case will actually stay just on the studs that attach to the transmission. Let me see if I can find the wood block I was using. There's a few different ways you can do this. The easiest way for me has been to just place a large piece of wood right there. Our first move is to lubricate the selector shaft with the O-ring and the shaft bore encase with some petroleum jelly. That's going to be this piece right here. Take a little bit of petroleum jelly and put it on the selector shaft. And if you remember from taking it out, it takes turning it a few different directions to get it back in there. You just need to keep turning it around until you find the angle that it actually falls through at. And then it's going to get rotated back until it's relatively in the position it was in when you took it out. This piece of wood I have here is actually in my way. Gets pushed all the way into place until it's snug. Okay, so to lubricate things, I'm going to take a little bit of ATF4 and pour it out into a container so I have access to it so that I can move it onto parts when I need to. This just makes it a little easier to do this by hand. Of course, you should probably be wearing gloves when you do all of this. The next thing we're going to do is lubricate the shift rail bushing with just a little bit of petroleum jelly. Don't go crazy, you just need enough in there to cover the walls of it. If you put too much in there, it may be difficult to push the shift rail all the way into position. Just want to make sure it's not completely dry. Of course, the shift rail bushing is the small hole that you see at the bottom of the case right now, next to the annular gear. So I'm going to take a little ATF and put it on the inside of both of these bearings and the other bearing in the other half of the case, just to make sure that they're not dry when they go together. And then it says to place the magnet in the case. So the magnet goes in this little slot right here, and just double check that you've gotten all the material off of it as you put it in. Lubricate the gears and thrust washers with recommended transmission fluid for our input. This is our input right here. We want to make sure that it's clean and that there's no material collected on it. And we're just going to put a little bit of ATF on it. Now I also need to remove this snap ring right here, which will eventually hold it in place. Just want to open the snap ring just enough to slide it off of the input shaft. And be sure you remember which side is up. Okay, so placing some ATF on some of these planetaries and the center gear to make sure that everything is rotating freely. If you see any debris, be sure to get it out of there. There's one little oil passage hole in the center gear, actually 5 or 6 I think. And just place some ATF on there until the whole thing is lubricated. Now of course, the snap ring that holds all of this together needs to be fully in place. We're going to install the input gear in the low range gear and be sure that it's fully seated. There should be 2 thrust washers inside this, so both of them need to be installed before this gets snapped together. Okay, while I have the input gear here, I'm actually going to double check to make sure that the thrust washer is installed in it. Okay, to get the snap ring out of the input gear, you may have to use 2 tools, one pushing in one location where there's a notch, and another pushing where the end of the actual snap ring is. Sometimes you can get it just from the end, depending on how good you are at getting it out of there. Sometimes this process takes 2 different size screwdrivers, a larger one to push in the notch and a smaller one to push on the end of the snap ring. In any case, get one side of the snap ring up and then keep pushing on it until you go all the way around and get it off. There should be a plate underneath the snap ring that comes up, and then below that plate there should be the plastic thrust washer. If you pull the gear out, on the other side there's another thrust washer just like this one. The whole thing comes back together the exact same way it came apart. Then just take the snap ring and, making sure that it lines up, push it back into the location it came out of. Alright, now the input gear is fully assembled again. And we're going to install the input gear. To get the input gear in, we need enough clearance underneath the front of the case for it to be able to fall all the way down into position. So I've set up some wood blocks here to hold it, and we need to make sure that we've already pre-lubricated the input gear a little bit. Of course, the input is what ends up connecting with the transmission. Go ahead and clean it off as best you can. Get any crud or dust or debris or anything that's left on it off of it right before you install it. If you've set it down on a table, it might have some more junk on it. And then we're going to orient it like this and drop it down into the case. And you're going to have to wiggle it a little bit for it to line up into position and then fall all the way into place. So there's the snap ring on the input gear to secure it in place. So we're going to take this entire thing and turn it to one side so that we can have access to the outside of this bearing. You can see on the outside of this bearing it just barely fits into position so that we can get this snap ring back in place. You want to find the notch and then place that notch opposite of where the opening is going to be in the snap ring. That notch should be 180 degrees from the opening of the snap ring. So place your snap ring pliers back on it and open it once again, orienting it so that it's 180 degrees away from the notch. Push it into the notch first, and then as you let it go, it should snap into place. Again, rotate the entire thing, checking it, pushing on it with a screwdriver, making sure that it's all the way seated. Usually it's not all the way seated, it's just close. Once you get it all the way seated, both sides should appear the same. If for some reason it doesn't seat all the way, it may need to be squeezed in a vise or with another tool to make sure that it's all the way seated. I'm going to use a pair of channel locks just to put a little bit more squeeze on this snap ring from both sides at once. Make sure I get it as far into location as I can. Alright, that's looking pretty solid. Alright, so now we're going to turn the front case back onto its front so that it's oriented like so. And again, place something underneath it to help hold it up. We're going to take the, let me make sure I call it the right thing, lubricate range fork pads with light coat of petroleum jelly. Okay, so these are the range fork pads. There's 3 of them and they're plastic. I'm going to put some petroleum jelly on the sides and the top of these. And this thing they're on is the range fork. And we're going to take the clutch sleeve that goes inside of it. I'm going to place them together. Put a little bit on the end of the rail right here. Okay, we're going to install the clutch sleeve in the range fork like I just did, and then we're going to install the assembled range fork and clutch sleeve, inserting range fork pin in selector, then rotate selector and sleek clutch clear in low range gear. Alright, so this pin right here is going to fit into the notch you see on the selector. And at the same time, it's going to fit into the case, the bottom of the rod. And then as all of this turns into position, it's going to fall into place in the input gear. So what needs to happen is the range selector needs to be moved up in such a way that you go into the range selector first. Then it needs to be oriented with the rod into the case. At the same time, the sleeve needs to fall down into the input gear. So when the entire thing is seated, it should look like this. You see the pin is in the range selector, and this gear is all the way flat with the range fork around it, and the rod is all the way in the case. So we want to make sure that it's oriented into the neutral position. Right now I'm not in the neutral position. I'm going to rotate the entire thing until it is in the neutral position. It should be the center of your three options on the NP249. So this center triangle of the three triangles that are present is the one that you're talking about. It's probably low range, neutral, and high range. And then once it's oriented like this, and also you'll see over here if your four-wheel drive selector switch is still in this position, it'll be touching. Then we're going to get the detente, the spring, and the part that goes into the selector. It should have a new O-ring on the actual nut right here, and we're going to reinstall this. Okay, so we're going to lubricate the detente spring with a little bit of petroleum jelly to help it go in. And we're going to find our socket that matches it again. In this case it was a 7/8 socket. And placing it in to position, just hand tighten this most of the way. And in fact, this is not something that's getting torqued. This is just something that we will tighten until we feel it snug. It's not a lot of pressure that goes on this. Just enough until it stops. It's an aluminum case. Once it stops, don't go any farther than that or you will crack the case. Alright, so there's our detente installed. Okay, next we're going to install the main shaft, the differential assembly. Hopefully if you took apart the differential for any reason, you have fully reassembled it completely. These parts fit together with gravity. Make sure this snap ring is all the way seated, and if you replace the bearing in it, hopefully it's perfectly straight. We can put a little bit of ATF here on the main shaft sprocket. There are some thrust washers in here, and there are some pinion gears. Everything needs to be fit together in such a way that it's perfectly seated. And these differential carrier bolts, if you had them out, are tightened to between 150 and 240 inch-pounds of torque. So what I usually do is I do some math for the difference between 240 and 150. We have 90 inch-pounds, so half of that would be 45. So 150 plus 45 would be 195 inch-pounds. So I would tighten these to at least 195 inch-pounds when putting it back together again. There are needle bearings on the inside of the main shaft gear. If you had it apart, definitely replace all those needle bearings. There are 53 of them. Okay, and now we're going to install the main shaft into the differential and then that main shaft snap ring. Again, I didn't take this apart. Everything appears to be moving quite fluidly in it. Okay, so we're going to take the assembled differential and main shaft gears, and we're going to install them into the clutch sleeve like so. So that's the installed assembled main shaft and differential in low range gear and clutch gears. So you can use gravity to make sure it's fully seated. And while you have the opportunity, you may want to clean off this shaft. Make sure that this rotates freely and is fully installed all the way. Should also technically be able to rotate the differential on it. Okay, so you can see the main shaft gear right here. This is going to be where the drive chain and the drive sprocket go onto the front output shaft. Going to start by lubricating the drive sprocket in this case. And we just want to make sure the inside of it is coated in ATF. Should be clean, as clean as possible. And this gear goes on like so. Should wiggle into place. Okay, we want to get that started like so. We're going to take our chain, still oriented the way that it was. We're going to also start it onto the main drive sprocket. And at the same time, we want to take our front output drive sprocket, this right here, and we want to also place it into its bearing location. Okay, and you're going to have to go around the front drive sprocket first. Then move the slack towards the other sprocket on the main gear, placing it through the chain and pulling it toward the main shaft, attempting to turn it until you get it to drop in place. You may have to lift up the rear drive sprocket with one hand while moving the other into place with the other hand. Once the chain is completely in place on the main gear sprocket and on the front drive shaft sprocket, you should be able to turn either one of them and see movement, and nothing should be binding. Okay, so if I turn this part, I should see movement on the other part, and everything should fit together. Now our next move is going to be to replace this snap ring on the main sprocket. I want to get it close to in position and open it up with a pair of snap ring pliers and take a look at where it's dropping into place. Push the back end of the snap ring into place first, then pull your snap ring pliers out. Hopefully they won't get stuck. And then you may take a screwdriver or something else to push the snap ring down into place. Again, make sure everything rotates, make sure everything is fully seated, and there should be some play as a result of the differential. If you hold one in place, the other should rotate through it, not exactly freely, but there shouldn't be any binding. Okay, next we're going to lubricate the main shaft before we drop the viscous coupling onto it. So I want to make sure we don't have any binding or any place that's too dry. So just go around it with some transmission fluid. I'll wear gloves because this stuff is probably slightly carcinogenic. I have enough health problems, so I'm not going to worry about it at the moment, but you might worry about it in the future. Then we're going to take the viscous coupling, which is sort of like a sealed differential, and we've already cleaned it off. We're going to gently move it into place until it sits on the main shaft like so. And then again, if you see any dust sticking to the fluid on it, just want to try and remove as much of that dust as possible. Alright, there's the viscous coupling in place. Alright, so to give you a different view of where we're at, we've got the viscous coupling in place, we've got the chain in place, we've got both of our front and rear sprockets in the front case. Okay, so now we're going to take the viscous coupling snap ring. We've got it oriented the same way we had it oriented originally. And we're going to get it close to in place. There are two different notches in the main shaft. And to get the viscous coupling one in the right place, it needs to go on the what's right now oriented as the lower one of the two. So there's absolutely no play between the viscous coupling and the snap ring. Of course, I'll double check to see that I cannot squeeze it any farther into position. Yeah, it's all the way in there. Okay, so we have another snap ring, exactly the same size. And it goes on before the oil pump does. So here's the oil pump locating snap ring. It's the same size as the one we just did to get the viscous coupling on. And it's going to go into this higher position right now, notch on the gear. Alright, so again I'm going to take some channel locks and just make sure that it's fully seated. It does look fully seated. Okay, so now we're going on to the rear case installation. The rear case is the other half of everything here. And it says to be sure that we clean the mating surface. Hopefully you really cleaned the mating surface. You can see that mine is gleaming happy, and I've taken all the grease off of it with a microfiber towel. There are a lot of ways you can clean this. One of my favorite ways is to use a wire wheel attached to a drill press. It allows you to not have it be quite so complicated as you're putting pressure on it to take all of the glue off of it. Right. The pickup tube right here has an O-ring flanged seal that goes on it. And then you'll see we place the pickup back into its position near where the bottom plug is. And what we really want to do is we want to put the other end through first into this notch over here, and then simultaneously push the pickup into place. It's kind of hard to get the two things to do what you want at the same time. Sometimes it takes moving it apart at the rubberized part in the middle here. But in any case, once you get them back together, this will stick through the edge of the case and the pickup will be in position. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. You move the rubber part until you see it's in the right location. And you want to push it closed until it reaches back into the original position that it was in. Okay, so there's the pickup installed in the case, sticking through on the other side in the little notch. Okay, so we're now ready to mate the two halves of the case together with one another. We're going to make sure that we again wipe off every last bit of the mating surface with a microfiber towel so we don't have any collected dust or grease from having handled it. And the same thing with the other side. It says to use a 1/8 inch bead of silicone adhesive sealant around all of these locations. So 1/8 is actually the smallest increment on the end of the tube that comes with Permatex. So you want to cut it off using some sort of a sharp blade at the last little indentation. But what we're going to do is we're going to go around each of the bolt holes in a circle. Make sure you've already popped open the Permatex. And just to make my life a little easier, I have this tool that was actually designed for a tube of toothpaste. And I'm going to push the end of the Permatex into it, and as I turn this device, it will squeeze the material. Alright, so going around each bolt hole in a circle until we have a nice even bead, and then continuing around the container. What you want is a continuous bead and then an additional bead around each bolt hole. This is a lot less than we would use to do a transmission pan or an engine oil pan. It's just enough to seal it. And you just want to make sure you have a continuous bead around each bolt hole, connected back to your main bead. Of course, the idea is that when this gets squished, that we don't have so much material that it ends up inside and coming free. And we want a decent seal for each bolt and for the totality of the case. There are a couple of locations that stick out. I usually go ahead and add some RTV there as well. We don't want anything leaking on us when it's installed in the vehicle, especially after we go through some serious off-roading. You can reinforce your places that you think it may be weak, or any place you see that the case is slightly damaged. You think it may be more likely to leak. Alright, so an 1/8 inch bead around all the relevant parts. Alright, so our pin is in place. Everything on the bottom half looks assembled. Our pickup tube is in place. This bearing is fully installed in the back here for the front drive shaft sprocket. So you want to flip the whole thing over, and using the selector fork pin as your guide, you want to slowly let the case down while holding it in such a way that it can become fully seated. And you should see the viscous coupling stick through, and this should fall all the way into place without any issue. Alright, so starting with the two special bolts that have the washer on either end near where the screwdriver hole is, we're just going to start by placing a couple of these here to make sure it's oriented tight. Alright, next I'm going to go get some thread locker blue, and we want to place just a small bead of thread locker blue on each of these bolts near the bottom where it's going to go into the bottom case. Doesn't need to be a crazy amount, it just needs to be some. And it needs to be on the part of the bolt that's going to go into the bottom case and become threaded. The fly, BB? Go ahead. Sorry, my cat is chasing a fly. Okay, so we go around the whole case and we add back all of our bolts. In general, I try to put them back in the same location they came from. And we're going to tighten these bolts to 20 to 25 foot-pounds. Again, these were all 15 millimeter bolts, with the exception of the one special bolt, which is a 12.10 millimeter bolt. Okay, and setting my torque wrench to 22 1/2 inch-pounds, because that's halfway between 20 and 25 inch-pounds, which the dealer service manual is saying is the correct tension. And going through and making sure that everybody is tightened to the same tightness. And just as a reminder, you probably want to be sure to get all of the bolts started before you tighten any of them too much, because you want to make sure that you can get them all started. And on the long bolt, that's the 10 millimeter, you need to place the thread locker in a different position, because where it actually ends up threading is much higher on the bolt, but in a similar location on the case. Okay, so there's everybody started. And if you have any issue getting all of them started, you may want to pull some of the other bolts back out a little bit and give them another try. In any case, you should have bolts all the way around before you start tightening. Okay, so in trying to get these tightened, you want to work your way evenly around the case. You may even want to switch sides occasionally. And keep putting all the bolts in a little farther and a little farther. Make sure everybody's turning. If one side gets tightened too fast, the other side might not tighten at all. So we just want to keep even pressure and an even number of turns on everything. Some people might think this is overkill, but I have had situations where I went one bolt at a time, and each time it got a little more difficult, and then eventually I had one that wouldn't go in at all. So you can be working without a torque wrench while you still can see you have thread left on each bolt. And as you get really close, you may want to switch over to the torque wrench. You can be sure that you don't over tighten anything. Don't have to worry about under tightening it, you just have to worry about over tightening it. And then every once in a while, I'm going to switch over and tighten the 10 millimeter bolt, which really won't be tight until we put the nut on the other side. I'm getting pretty close now, so I'm going to actually take this 10 millimeter bolt in most of the way. And just leave a few turns on it for when I have the torque wrench. And most of our 15 millimeter bolts are really close to seated. You could of course do this with an air ratchet, but I would be very careful and just stop 2 or 3 turns before reaching the end. You want to still have some threads showing so that you know that what you're doing with your torque wrench is accurate. Alright, so switching over to the torque wrench, already set at 22.5 foot-pounds. We did tightening the case, and to get it fully tight you may actually need a little bit of leverage. Now I have an extension on here. It's actually a good idea to remove the extension as you get close to being fully tight. And look out, you don't want to get Permatex on your hand, so don't grab the case anywhere that the bead is sticking out. You can hear the click. You just want to go around. Now going in order. Until you get the click on every bolt. How hard that click is may change, and you want to keep tightening the end of the torque wrench and making sure it's tight. How loud the click is can change too, depending on how your torque wrench is set up. You should get a click. And you may have to hold it in different ways to get the leverage you need. And sometimes if you're pushing really hard, the click might not be as obvious. There we go. Switch over to the 10mm. The 10mm, the torque wrench might hit the case, or it might not. The notch in the case will make it easier. Hear it click there. And alright, I've been around the case one time and torqued everything. If you want, you might want to go back around the case a second time and just double check that now that there's tension everywhere, that everybody's still tight. Alright, that's the case reassembled. And if you got some Permatex on your hand, now's a good time to remove it, or some thread locker. And you should be able to see a little bead everywhere that you haven't touched it, squeezed out. And hopefully that's going to seal really good. Now lastly, we're going to take our little piece of metal that holds the wiring harness in place. We're going to put it back on the 10mm bolt and then re-tighten this 15mm nut. Okay, so our next step is going to be to install the oil pump. We're going to take the rest of the pickup tube like so, and we're going to push it onto the other pickup tube, and it's going to point directly at the main shaft. Okay, so before I had this little O-ring in the wrong position, I'm going to take him back off. He actually goes on the end here of the oil tube, and we push this piece onto this piece, and then we orient this so that it's pointed at the main drive shaft. Now we're going to reinstall the oil pump. We need the bearing side down. You can see that the hole that connects to the pickup tube is on the bottom. And then as it slides into place, we either need to push the pickup tube into it or disconnect the pickup tube at the halfway point. Either way, we need a good solid connection between the pickup tube and the oil pump, and it should actually push into place. Now remember, the snap ring is on the main shaft below it. And the pickup tube, when correctly installed, looks like this. Pickup tube is all the way into the oil pump and all the way seated against its connection to the other part of the pickup tube. Alright, so that's our oil pump installed. Okay, after the oil pump, the next thing we're going to install is the main bearing. The main bearing has a groove on one side for the snap ring that fits into the retainer. We could put a little bit of ATF in there or a little bit of petroleum jelly, either one. I'm going to slide it all the way down the main shaft until it's seated and the groove is on the top in this case. Okay, we now have a main bearing snap ring that holds this main bearing in place. And this is the snap ring that has these two little holes in it. I may have to use these other snap ring pliers in this case. Get it open far enough to fit down the main shaft. Whatever works. Alright. So pushing it open and pushing the back end in first, and then close it with the snap ring pliers, and I'm just going to push on it with a screwdriver. It's now snapped into place and in the correct position. Still have some rotation, and the rear bearing still rotates. So that looks good. Put a little bit of ATF in the rear bearing while I have it here. The next thing we're going to install is the speedometer drive gear. We need to ensure that it's in the same position that it was in before. There's a flange on one end, and this one other end is smaller. In this case, the flange is going to be oriented towards the sky, and we slide it onto the main shaft like so. Okay, and if for some reason you have removed the rear bearing snap ring in the retainer, now you need to snap that retainer, that ring back into the retainer. You may have to close it in order to get it into position, and it should be popped in there before you go to put the two back together again. Now we're going to apply another bead of 1/8 inch wide Mopar silicone adhesive sealer, or Permatex, or whatever you're using, or the equivalent, and we're going to let it slightly set up. So we're going to actually do that on the retainer itself. I'm going to go around all of them in a circle, down the center of the mating surface, and I also like to add some more along the inside edge of the mating surface. So you'll see there's a little lip on the retainer, and I actually like to go along the inside of this lip and add a second bead of silicone sealant, so you don't want it leaking. Just make sure your beads connect. And if you see any place you feel like it's a little thin, you can beef it up slightly. And the dealer service manual says to allow it to set up slightly before attempting to reassemble the retainer. That's just because it gets messy. Of course, there's a fine line between it being too thin and there being too much. You went fast and you feel like you don't have an 1/8 inch bead. Nothing wrong with adding a little bit more, especially when you've used the funnel this way I have. Some people get really annoyed about using this tip. They just use the container without the tip. Leads to less waste. But you need to be careful not to overdo it. Now I might just let that set up for a minute or two. Now to orient the retainer, you have the main shaft, which is going to go into this small section here. You want to take the entire thing and orient it in such a way that the shaft makes contact first. And it should drop effortlessly into place. You really don't want to overdo it with the thread locker red. You just want pretty much the smallest bead you can get on there. That's going to be enough. It's red for a reason. It's like caution. Just one little bead on there. Okay, and of course, we need to do that snap ring. I've never been able to do the snap ring with it oriented vertically. We just want to put these bolts in part of the way, most of the way. And then we're going to have to turn this entire unit on its side and get that snap ring onto the rear bearing.
Sometimes having a little bit of play in the retainer is still a good idea. You don't want so much that you can't move it.
All right. It's gotten a little heavier in the last few moves here. Hopefully you still have no issue. And you can see you won't really be able to push it all the way into place until you get that snap ring on. Okay, well, this might not be ideal for the rear seal. It may give us the advantage we need. In fact, I can't have it resting on the rear seal like that because the shaft is then being pushed up. So something like this, where it's at an angle, may work the best. And you can tell because now the snap ring is trapped. Move it back where I need it to be, hopefully. Sort of in the middle there. Now I may or may not be able to just push it apart. Gravity may help the main shaft end up in the right position. Okay, so now gravity has helped me to push the snap ring onto the rear bearing. You can see I oriented it, and I couldn't put it in such a way that the main shaft didn't have room to move, or it wouldn't have moved. Alright, so let's double check what size these retainer bolts are. They are 1/2 and the rear retainer bolts are from 20 to 25 foot-pounds again, so I'm going to use my torque wrench set at 22.5 foot-pounds. hopefully you didn't take too long, like I didn't take too long, and your thread locker red has not all the way turned into a rock. I think we should be fine in the amount of time I took there. And go ahead and leave maybe a turn or two so you can move it with the torque wrench. Just as long as you can still see a little bit of space between the bolt flange and the bottom of the retainer, you should be fine. And of course that snap ring should both still be in its position in the retainer and should be in the groove in the rear bearing. Okay, so torquing it to the same place we torqued the other bolts for the case. And in the process here, I might take the tension off of it that is being placed on it right now. It's looking just slightly crooked. I'm going to take that bolt back off and just wiggle it ever so slightly until I'm happier with the way that it's lining up. And every once in a while it's a good idea to check your torque wrench. Make sure it hasn't come loose. If it has come loose, it might be good to double check that it's still in the right place. Okay, so all 4 retainer bolts have been tightened until they click. Good. Okay, we're going to install the locating ring access cover, and we're going to tighten it to 85 inch-pounds. Now, in this case, I have a cork cork gasket, and I'm just going to add a little bit of Permatex to it. It's on the top of the unit, so it doesn't really have to hold a seal much, but just in case, I'm going to add a small amount of adhesive sealant to it. And you might be replacing this gasket entirely, depending on your rebuild kit and whether you have it. There's no reason we can't reuse the old one. It's basically not under any pressure. And so put it in location, and then get your 2 screws. And of course it was a T25 Torx bit that we used to get it on there. Same thing with the other side. And then we're going to use our inch-pound torque wrench set at 85. So let's see, there's 80, there's 85. And just ensure that we tighten this the right amount of tight. You don't want to strip it out because it's very easy to do. The click on the smaller torque wrench might be a lot harder to feel. So you want to keep going and tightening it as you go, and you want to hold down on it. And if it feels snug and you're not getting a click, better to stop than to strip it out. So that's tight enough. Alright, now we're going to do the front bearing retainer and then the yoke and the range lever installation. Here is our input shaft where the front bearing goes, and here is our front bearing retainer. Again, we want to make sure we pull any debris off of this device, that it's as clean as we can get it. And then we're going to put a bead along the inside of the front bearing retainer, just like we did with the rear bearing. In this case, I tend to go down the middle of the mating surface, and then for these two side pieces for where you're going to take it off later, I go around them. And we want to put a full circle around each of the bolt holes. Any place that gets too messy, go ahead and put some more. If you have a break in the bead from going too fast, just go ahead and add some. And you want a full 1/8 inch bead in general. So any place that looks weak or thin, go ahead and add a little bit more. We definitely don't want this to leak, especially after we beat the hell out of it on the road. Alright, so it should look something like that. I'm going to let that set up for a minute or two. Okay, and you can see that there's this little oil catch here on the bottom. And we want to end up orienting that oil catch in such a way that it matches up with this hole. There's a hole in the mating surface right there, and then there's that right there. Oil's going to enter into this bearing through that. So we're going to turn the piece until we see the hole line up with the other part. And then we're going to go ahead and go around the inside of the seal with a little bit of either petroleum jelly or ATF. First we have to, at a slight angle, slide that onto the seal. And then watching to make sure that we've oriented it the right way, just gently push it towards where it's going to end up. Now, I put some thread locker glue on these 4 bolts. Get them each started. You don't gotta go crazy, just enough. Alright, and this was a 10mm, I believe. So you can get them started and move things along a little bit. And the dealer service manual says to tighten these to 12 to 18 foot-pounds of torque. So we're going to get our torque wrench and set it to 15 15 foot-pounds. 15 is on the lower end of this torque wrench, but it's no problemo to set it there. Okay, and we can keep tightening these by hand until we get closer. And letting our Permatex and our thread locker start setting up. Go ahead and push it all the way flat. And once you get close, you might need to use a wrench. Alright, and tighten them with the torque wrench. Listen for the click. Definitely don't want to overdo it and snap off one of these bolts. Everything here is aluminum, with the exception of the bolts. Hi, baby. Okay, so we can check them again. Sometimes they'll tighten up a little bit more. Sometimes they won't. Alright, that's where we want them to be. And I can see a little bead of the silicone all the way around. And a good indicator that we have enough for a seal. Okay, now we're going to install the front yoke washer, which is the seal washer we took off before. And you need to line it up so that it lines up with the gear. This can get a little beat up over time, but hopefully it's no issue. Then we want to take the front yoke and fit it over both the washer and everything else. There's a special tool that holds this in place that I don't have. And this is a good time to check and make sure everything is rotating. You should see movement at the rear retainer. Alright, there's my pipe wrench, correctly oriented. You may even want to shove something underneath it to give it a better grip on the yoke. I've got it up against the edge of the table here, so that'll have to be good enough. And you may put some little bite marks in the yoke doing this, to be honest. If you really want to keep everything perfectly clean, it might be good to go ahead and get tool C32A1. It's your prerogative. Of course, this holds our front drive shaft in the vehicle, and as a result takes quite a bit of torque sometimes. At some point I might want to move over to the other side where I have the most leverage, because I'm not even close to tight yet and it's still getting harder and harder to move. Good to use gravity to your advantage. Alright, so that's tight now. And I did mar it slightly, but not too bad. Nothing a little paint won't cure. I had already painted it, so really all I marred was the paint. And it says I could have installed it to less tightness. It was 90 to 130 foot-pounds, so I might have overdone it, but in this case I don't want my drive shaft ever going anywhere, so It's as tight as it can get. Alright, so now we're going to do the range lever and the lock nut that goes with it. So here's our range lever. Now mind you, we're in neutral, but it still should only go one way. And you could move it around if you wanted to check. Without the leverage of the rest of the arm attached to it, it's a little difficult, but it should be about there. Shouldn't be up in the air over here. Tighten this to 22.5 foot-pounds again, like the case bolts. So we'll find out what size it is. I have a 9/16 here. That looks like the right size. So here's my adapter. I may not still have room after I put the adapter on there with the yoke on. So instead of putting the adapter first, I'm going to put an extension first. And hopefully I don't have this upside down or backwards. The metal part is never upside down or backwards, but the little rubber part, if you did get it backwards, might need to be moved. And it may switch out of neutral. Alright. That's tight. If you remove the four-wheel drive switch, now would be the time to reinstall it. It gets installed to 15 to 25 foot-pounds. And the next thing would be to fill the transfer case, which I choose to do in the vehicle. So that's our reassembly of the NP249 transfer case. This one's out of a 94 Jeep Grand Cherokee. There's also the speedo that needs to be installed on the speedo gear. In my case, I need to pull it off of my other transfer case before I install it. Thanks for joining me, and I hope this was informative. As always, please like and subscribe to this video so I can send you more information in the future. Thanks a lot.